So here we go. The international community decided to break out the symbolic wrist slap against Israel for us. The Hill says, the United Nations General Assembly voted Wednesday to blame Israel for violence in Gaza last month, rejecting a U.S. amendment that would have condemned Hamas as well. The 193-member assembly approved the resolution by a vote of 120 to 8, with 45 nations abstaining. The measure, sponsored by Palestine, Turkey, and Algeria, comes roughly a month after dozens of Palestinians were killed during protests along the Gaza border. Prior to voting on the full text, the Assembly voted on a U.S. amendment to condemn Hamas. While the measure received support from a narrow majority, it did not earn two-thirds support and failed. The Assembly went on to approve the original resolution. Okay, so let me break this down for you, because this is being spun in 1,000 ways, and people are misleading people about it. So, first of all, when you propose just the idea of, hey, should we condemn Hamas, it gets a majority. It gets a majority. Now, it didn't get two-thirds, but it got a majority. Now, putting that one aside, because that's a separate question, when you ask specifically about the recent violence in Gaza, and you say, should we blame Israel or should we blame Israel and Hamas? Overwhelmingly, 120 to 8, they say, we blame Israel. Why? Well, very simply, because 100% of the deaths were on the Palestinian side. Not a single Israeli was killed. Not a single Israeli was injured. So that's quite a weird thing to blame Hamas when all of the casualties were on the Palestinian side and they were killed not by Hamas, by Israel. So what the U.S. did, this is an attempt to obfuscate. It's like, oh, in the recent violence, who's to blame? Well, the facts are it's Israel that massacred, in many cases, innocent Palestinian protesters with snipers from 200 yards away. They killed journalists. They killed people praying, literally. So the U.S. tried to obfuscate and say, oh, but Hamas is bad too. Aren't they bad? They're bad, aren't they bad? And basically the response from the UN was, what the fuck does that have to do with the instance that just occurred in Gaza? We could all say Hamas is bad. A majority did. But then it's 120 to 8 blaming Israel for the violence because they actually are responsible for the fucking violence. And then, of course, Nikki Haley threw a fucking tantrum and released a statement and was scolding the UN. And what's the old trick they go to? Anti-Semitism. Always. The only reason the UN is doing this, they single out Israel in an unfair way. Not only is that not true, that is hilariously untrue. So, I mentioned how, this is another wrist slap to Israel. Why do I say it's a wrist slap? Well, very simply, this is a motion in the General Assembly. So, they're blaming Israel for the violence. By the way, it 100% is Israel's fault. So they're factually correct to blame Israel for the violence. But it's a wrist slap because this isn't the Security Council. The Security Council is where stuff is actually binding. The General Assembly, this is all symbolic. It's like, it's Israel's fault. What are you going to do about it? Nothing. So they love to talk about how, the UN unfairly cracks down on it, singles out Israel. It's unfair. The UN created Israel. They created them. The idea that it's like, they're unfairly biased against them. There is no official Palestinian state recognized by the UN. Why wouldn't we say, they're biased against the Palestinians? And the UN Security Council is where it matters. If you condemn them in the UN Security Council, something might actually be done about it, so that's where it matters. Well, guess what? The UN went a full fucking 14 years without condemning Israel in the UN Security Council. Why? Because the US always fucking vetoes it. The one time they didn't was, I think, at the end of Obama's time in office. But again, nothing was really done about it. They just did it in the Security Council for once. The last time before that was fucking 2002. But they love to point out, 86% of the condemnations against Israel are done in the UN. The condemnations 86% of the time go against Israel. Well, number one, maybe those condemnations are there because you're a fucking apartheid state and you're doing illegal occupation. So maybe, I don't know, you earned it? That's a crazy idea, I know. But again, the second half of that conversation is, as much as you would say they're biased against Israel in the General Assembly, they're biased in favor of Israel in the Security Council, where they don't do anything against Israel. So totally misleading, and they're going to try to spin this as if it's, oh my God, it's anti-Semitism, that they're blaming Israel for massacring civilians, and of course it's not anti-Semitism, it's just a factual depiction of the events that happened, which is why it was 120-8 against Israel, but nothing's going to happen because it's just a fucking slap on the wrist, and the U.S. is going to huff and puff and act like it's unfair, even though it's totally fair.